February 27, 1943. 22:30 hours, Hardangervidda Plateau, Norway. The temperature was -27 degrees Celsius. The wind came off the plateau in gusts that made standing upright a conscious act of will. In the darkness, 11 men moved on skis across a landscape that offered nothing, no shelter, no warmth, no landmark that an untrained eye could have identified in the white uniformity of the Arctic winter. They were moving toward a cliff. Below the cliff, 300 meters down through frozen air, ran the river Mona. Beyond the river, built into the rock face of the opposite side of the gorge, was the Vemork hydroelectric plant, the most heavily guarded industrial installation in occupied Europe, a place where the German Reich was producing the one substance that its nuclear scientists had concluded was essential for building a working reactor. The 11 men were not soldiers in any conventional sense. They were Norwegians, which meant they were subjects of an occupied country, men without an army or a government or a functioning state, men whose country had been overrun in 62 days 3 years earlier, and whose best option for fighting back was exactly this: skis in the darkness, explosives in a rucksack, and a target that the German security apparatus had assessed as impregnable. They had been told, in the careful language of British intelligence briefings, that what they were about to attempt had never been successfully executed against a comparable installation. They had also been told, in language considerably less careful, what would happen to Germany's nuclear program if they failed. They already knew what had happened to the 21 British airborne soldiers who had tried and failed 4 months earlier. The Germans had not taken them prisoner. 11 Norwegians moved in the dark toward a cliff above a frozen river. What they did in the next 3 hours would alter the physics of the 20th century. The substance being produced at Vemork was called heavy water, and its importance to the German nuclear program in early 1943 was a question that physicists on both sides of the war understood precisely, and that military commanders on both sides understood imperfectly. Heavy water, deuterium oxide, is chemically indistinguishable from ordinary water in appearance and in most of its properties. It is heavier, its molecules containing a heavier isotope of hydrogen, and this additional mass gives it a property that nuclear physicists in the late 1930s had identified as critical for a particular approach to building a nuclear reactor. In a fission reactor, the neutrons released by splitting uranium atoms must be slowed down, moderated, before they can reliably trigger further splitting in adjacent atoms and sustain a chain reaction. Several substances can moderate neutrons. Graphite is one. Heavy water is another, and in the judgment of Werner Heisenberg, the Nobel laureate physicist directing the German nuclear program, it was the more reliable option. Heisenberg's program had been running since 1939, when the discovery of nuclear fission by Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann in Berlin had opened the theoretical possibility of a weapon of unprecedented destructive power. By 1942, Heisenberg's team had demonstrated that a self-sustaining chain reaction was theoretically achievable with the materials available to them. What they needed, in quantities that dwarfed anything they had so far accumulated, was heavy water. And the only installation in the world capable of producing heavy water in the quantities Heisenberg required was Vemork. The Vemork plant had been built by the Norsk Hydro Company in 1934 to produce ammonia for fertilizer, using the prodigious hydroelectric power generated by the waterfalls above the Musvatn reservoir. Heavy water was a byproduct of the electrolysis process, produced in minute quantities that Norsk Hydro had initially regarded as a curiosity rather than a commercial product. By 1939, the plant was producing approximately 12 kilograms of heavy water per month. By 1940, after Germany occupied Norway and the Wehrmacht installed its own managers at Vemork with instructions to maximize heavy water output, production had been expanded toward the 150 kilograms per month that Heisenberg's program required. The plant sat on a rock ledge above the Vestfjord Valley, accessible by a single suspension bridge across the gorge that the Germans guarded with a permanent force of soldiers, by a cable railway on the valley wall that was also guarded, and by the gorge itself, which was 300 meters of vertical rock on both sides, ice-covered in winter, and which no military planner had seriously assessed as a practical infiltration route because no military planner had been thinking about the route from a Norwegian skier's perspective. The man who changed that perspective was Leif Tronstad, and his contribution to the Vemork operation was so fundamental that the 11 men on the plateau owed their chances of success almost entirely to information that only Tronstad possessed. Tronstad was a professor of inorganic chemistry at the Norwegian Institute of Technology in Trondheim, and he had been one of the principal scientists involved in designing and commissioning the Vemork plant in the early 1930s. He knew the plant's internal layout with a precision that no aerial reconnaissance photograph could provide. He knew the location of the high concentration room where the heavy water cells were installed, the arrangement of the electrolytic cells themselves, the routing of the pipes, the placement of the drainage systems, and the specific components whose destruction would require the longest time to replace, months rather than weeks, if the demolition was done correctly. He had escaped from Norway to Britain in the autumn of 1941, crossing the North Sea in a fishing boat as German forces consolidated their occupation, and the Gestapo began systematically hunting Norwegian scientists and intellectuals with foreign contacts. In London, he had placed himself at the disposal of the Special Operations Executive, the organization Churchill had established in 1940 to coordinate sabotage and subversion in occupied Europe, and had spent the following year providing the SOE's Norwegian section with intelligence so precise that British planners were eventually confident they could direct a demolition team to the exact cell positions inside the Vemork plant, without having to search, without having to improvise, without having to spend any of the operation's irreplaceable time doing anything other than placing charges and withdrawing. Tronstad told the planners something else that mattered enormously. The gorge could be crossed. At the bottom, the river Mona in winter was partially frozen, its surface solid enough in places for a man to cross on foot. The rock face on the plant side of the gorge, while steep, had vegetation and ledge formations that a skilled climber could use to ascend to the plant's level. The Germans had not guarded the gorge approach because they had not believed it possible. Tronstad had spent enough time at Vemork to know that their assessment was wrong. The British planners who received Tronstad's intelligence produced their first operational plan in the autumn of 1942, and it was a plan that prioritized speed and force over the kind of precision that the intelligence made available. Operation Freshman called for a force of Royal Engineers, specialists in demolition rather than in mountain warfare, to be landed near the plateau by glider, linked up with a Norwegian advance team that had already been inserted by parachute, guided to the target, and extracted overland through Sweden. It was a plan that made sense on paper and that contained within itself the seeds of catastrophe in almost every element. The Norwegian advance team, codenamed Grouse, had been dropped on the Hardangervidda plateau in October 1942. They were 4 men: Jens Anton Poulsen, Arne Kjelstrup, Klaus Hellberg, and Knut Haugland. Their mission was to survive on the plateau, maintain radio contact with London, reconnoiter the target, and be ready to guide the freshman gliders to a landing zone when the operation launched. They had received training in Britain and had been told to expect the gliders within weeks. They would wait for months. The Hardangervidda in the winter of 1942 was one of the harshest environments in occupied Europe. The 4 men lived in a series of abandoned hunting huts, hunting reindeer for food when their supplies ran out, moving when German patrols came close, maintaining the radio schedule with London through equipment that the cold frequently disabled and that required constant manual intervention to keep functioning. They had received enough food for roughly 2 months. They survived for 4. The willingness to remain, to continue waiting in conditions that would have ended most operations through simple attrition, was not addressed in their operational orders because no operational order can specify the kind of commitment that the Grouse team displayed. It was a personal quality that the 4 men had brought with them onto the plateau, and that they kept intact through 4 months of cold and hunger and isolation that none of their training had fully replicated. Operation Freshman launched on the night of November 19, 1942. 2 Halifax bombers, each towing a Horsa glider, carrying 17 Royal Engineers with their demolition equipment, departed from Skitten Airfield in Scotland. The operational concept required the bombers to find the landing zone on the Hardangervidda plateau, using a radio beacon transmitted by the Grouse team, release the gliders at a position from which the engineers could land and march to the link-up point and return to Scotland. What happened instead demonstrated with brutal efficiency the gap between operational planning and operational reality in Norwegian winter conditions. The cloud cover over the plateau was denser than forecast. The Rebecca Eureka radio navigation system, which was supposed to guide the bombers to the Grouse beacon, malfunctioned in one aircraft and gave unreliable readings in the other. One tow cable broke. The first glider crashed into a mountain in the Lissefjord area. The second aircraft and glider attempted to return to Scotland, became disoriented in cloud and also crashed, the glider going down near Egersund on the southwest coast of Norway, far from the intended landing zone. Of the 41 men involved in the Freshman operation, 17 died in the crashes. The survivors, wounded and scattered across terrain they did not know, were captured by German forces within hours. Hitler had issued a directive in October 1942, the Kommandobefehl, ordering that Allied commandos captured behind German lines be executed rather than treated as prisoners of war. The Freshman survivors were interrogated by the Gestapo and then executed. Their bodies were disposed of by the German security services. The Vemork plant was untouched. The Germans, who now knew that the Allies were aware of the plant's importance and were willing to conduct operations against it, reinforced the garrison, added additional lighting and alarm systems, and for a period placed the suspension bridge under such heavy guard that a frontal approach became even more clearly impossible than it had been before. London received the report of Freshman's failure and concluded 2 things simultaneously. The first was that a glider-borne assault using soldiers unfamiliar with Norwegian terrain would not work regardless of how carefully the approach was planned. The second was that the operation had to be retried because the intelligence about German progress on the nuclear reactor had not improved. The SOE's Norwegian section proposed an alternative that was simpler in concept and more demanding in execution. A team of Norwegian soldiers trained in Britain, all of them experienced in mountain and winter warfare, parachuted directly onto the plateau, linked with the surviving Grouse team, and tasked with penetrating the Vemork plant using the gorge route that Tronstad had identified and that the Freshman planners had considered and set aside in favor of the more direct but more heavily defended approach. The new operation was called Gunnerside. Its commander was Joachim Rønneberg, who was 23 years old, had escaped from Norway through Sweden in 1941, had been trained by the SOE at a series of facilities in Scotland and England, and who possessed the specific combination of physical capability, technical competence, and command temperament that the SOE's assessors had concluded the operation required. The 5 men Rønneberg selected to accompany him were similarly chosen, each bringing something specific. Birger Strømsheim, who was Rønneberg's closest collaborator in the demolition planning. Fredrik Kaiser, Kasper Edland, Hans Storhaug, and Halvard Hengja. They trained together for several months, rehearsing the demolition sequence on a mock-up of the high concentration room that the SOE had constructed in Britain using Tronstad's specifications, until each man could find the cell positions in darkness, place the charges correctly, connect the detonators, and clear the building in under 2 minutes. The Gunnerside team jumped over the Hardangervidda on the night of February 16, 1943. The drop itself was successful, which, given the freshman precedent and the conditions on the plateau, represented a form of progress. The problem was that the winds had carried them several kilometers from the intended landing zone, and a storm moved in immediately after the drop that made movement across the plateau nearly impossible for 2 days. When the storm cleared, Rønneberg and his 5 men were alive, their equipment was intact, and they needed to find the Grouse team somewhere on a plateau of 9,000 square kilometers of featureless white terrain. They found them on February 22nd, 4 days after landing, when Helberg of the Grouse team encountered the Gunnerside men moving along a valley and recognized them by their British-issued equipment. The reunion was, by the accounts of both teams, an intensely emotional moment that the men themselves described afterwards in characteristically understated terms. Poulsen and his 3 companions had been on the plateau for 4 months. They were thin and physically depleted, but mentally intact and operationally ready, which was the quality that mattered. They provided the Gunnerside team with everything they had learned about German patrol patterns, guard schedules, the condition of the approach routes, and the current state of the plant's external defenses. Rønneberg absorbed this information and confirmed what Tronstad's original intelligence had suggested. The gorge was still unguarded. The approach that the Germans considered impossible remained the best option available. The operation was initially scheduled for February 23rd and postponed due to weather. It launched on the night of February 27th. The team descended from the plateau toward the valley floor in 2 groups with assigned roles. A covering party of 4 men, including Poulsen and Helberg, would remain in the approach area above the plant to provide fire support and cover the withdrawal if the demolition party was discovered before or during the operation. The demolition party of 6, led by Rønneberg with Strømsheim as his primary assistant, would cross the gorge, scale the cliff, penetrate the plant, place the charges, and withdraw on the same route. The covering party carried enough ammunition to fight a delaying action if necessary. Rønneberg had been explicit with both groups about what the covering party's action in case of German response would and would not accomplish. It would buy time, not rescue. The demolition party would complete the mission regardless of what happened to the covering party, and the covering party would fight regardless of what happened to the demolition party. These instructions were not discussed at length because the men who received them understood them without elaboration. The descent to the valley floor took several hours. The river Mona was partially frozen, as Tronstad had predicted, and the crossing, while requiring care to find solid ice, was accomplished without incident by all 6 men of the demolition party. The cliff face on the opposite side was covered in ice and took longer than the training estimates had suggested, but the holds were there as Tronstad had said, and by 2300 hours, the demolition party had reached the level of the plant's lower access area without triggering any alarm. What they found at the perimeter was not what the intelligence had described. The railway gate on the lower approach, which had been reported as occasionally unlocked, was locked. The cable from the railway line, which provided a concealed entry path to the plant's lower level, required crossing a lit area near a guard position. Rønneberg changed the approach on the spot, moving the team to a second entry point that Tronstad's briefings had identified as a secondary option. A cable conduit tunnel that ran from the plant's exterior into the basement of the high-concentration building. It was a tight passage. Getting through it required removing rucksacks and pushing them ahead. But it led directly to the room they needed to reach, and it bypassed every guard position that stood between the perimeter and the target. Rønneberg and Strømsheim went through the conduit first. The others followed. They emerged in the basement of the high-concentration room and found themselves in the space that Tronstad's mock-up had reproduced with sufficient accuracy that both men recognized their positions immediately. The room contained 18 electrolytic cells arranged in 2 rows. The cells were connected by a series of pipes and manifolds that fed the concentrated heavy water product to collection points at the room's end. Tronstad had specified the exact pipe connections where a shaped charge of the type they were carrying would cause both immediate destruction of the cells and structural damage to the manifolds that would require replacement of components that were not available in Norway and would need to be manufactured in Germany, adding months to the recovery timeline beyond what simple repair would require. Rønneberg and Strømsheim worked in silence. The charges were placed with the precision that months of rehearsal had built into the process until it required no conscious decision-making, only execution. The fuses were 2-minute standard British demolition fuses. They were reliable but not infinitely so, and Rønneberg had specified in his operational plan that if the primary fuses failed to ignite the charges before the team cleared the building, the mission was over and the withdrawal would proceed. He had not wanted his men making judgments about returning to a building with armed charges inside it. There was a Norwegian worker in the room. He had been on the late shift, conducting the routine monitoring tasks that the cells required throughout the night, and he had heard the demolition team entering through the conduit in the seconds before they emerged. He did not raise an alarm, whether this was because he recognized immediately that the men who came through the conduit were not German, or because he understood what they were doing and chose silence, or simply because the shock of seeing armed men appear from a basement conduit is not an experience that produces rapid action in most people, cannot be precisely determined from the accounts that survive. Rønneberg told him quietly in Norwegian that he would not be harmed and should remain still. The man asked one thing. His glasses were in another room. If there was an explosion, he said, he would need his glasses to find his way home. Rønneberg sent one of the other men to retrieve the glasses. The glasses were found and returned. The charges were in place. The fuses were lit at approximately 23:30 hours. The demolition party moved toward the exit. The explosion was smaller than anyone had expected. The precision of the charge placement, which Tronstad's intelligence had made possible, meant that the charges destroyed exactly what they were designed to destroy without triggering any of the secondary effects: fire, structural collapse, pressure vessel rupture that would have produced a larger detonation. German guards on the suspension bridge, 40 meters from the building's exterior wall, heard the explosion but initially could not determine its source. The plant's alarm system did not trigger immediately because the explosion had not tripped the sensors positioned for fire or major structural events. By the time the German garrison understood that an internal demolition had occurred and activated the full perimeter response, the demolition party was descending the cliff face they had ascended 2 hours earlier. The covering party, which had been positioned to open fire if the alarm was raised before the demolition team had withdrawn, never fired a shot. The entire operation was executed without a single bullet leaving a single weapon. 500 kilograms of accumulated heavy water drained from ruptured cells onto the basement floor and into the plant's drainage system. 18 electrolytic cells were destroyed. The manifolds and pipe connections that Tronstad had identified as the critical long-lead components were severed in ways that would require factory-manufactured replacements. Germany's heavy water production at Vemork had ended. The timeline for restarting it, which German engineers would assess in the following days, was a minimum of 5 months. The 11 men withdrew in 2 groups. The Grouse team moved north toward the plateau and eventually toward Sweden, crossing the border on skis over a route that Helberg had been the first to scout months earlier. The Gunnerside team moved in a different direction, splitting further as they went, some making for Sweden immediately, others remaining in Norway for subsequent operations. Rønneberg himself skied approximately 400 kilometers across the plateau to Sweden over the following weeks, a journey that he completed without being intercepted by German patrols that were, by then, searching the plateau with an intensity that reflected how clearly the German command understood what had been done to them at Vemork. He reached Sweden and eventually Britain. The German reprisals in the Rjukan valley below Vemork were immediate and severe, involving arrests, interrogations, and the collective punishment of the local population that was the standard German response to resistance operations in Norway. They did not find the men who had done it. The men who had done it were already gone onto a plateau that the German security forces could not effectively search in winter conditions, moving toward a border that, once crossed, put them beyond German reach. The damage assessment that German engineers produced in the days after the attack confirmed what Runneberg and Tronstad had planned for. The 18 cells were destroyed. The critical manifold components were not repairable with materials available in Norway. Replacement parts would have to be manufactured in Germany and transported north, a process that the German supply system in occupied Norway, already stretched by the demands of the garrison, could not complete in weeks. The most optimistic German engineering estimate for restoring production was 5 months. The actual restoration, which the Germans pursued with considerable urgency, given what they understood the heavy water program to require, took approximately that long. By the time Vemork was again producing heavy water in meaningful quantities in late 1943, the Allied intelligence services had acquired sufficient information about the German nuclear program's actual state of development to form a more complete picture of what Heisenberg's team had and had not accomplished. The picture was complicated. Werner Heisenberg was, by the assessment of almost every physicist who had worked with him before the war, a scientist of exceptional capability. He had won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1932 for foundational work in quantum mechanics that remained among the most consequential theoretical contributions of the century. His direction of the German nuclear program from 1939 onward had been energetic and resourceful within the constraints that the German war economy and the ideological peculiarities of the Third Reich's relationship with theoretical physics imposed on him. But Heisenberg had made a calculation error of fundamental importance, one that would not be definitively identified until after the war, when American and British scientists examined the full record of the German program during the Alsos mission. Heisenberg had significantly overestimated the quantity of fissile material required to produce a nuclear explosion. His estimate for the critical mass of uranium-235 needed for a bomb was substantially higher than the correct figure, which meant that his program's assessment of how long it would take to accumulate sufficient weapons-grade material was also substantially too pessimistic, but which also meant that the Germans were not, in the critical years of 1942 and 1943, as close to a functional weapon as the Allied intelligence services feared. The question of whether the Vemork sabotage was decisive in preventing a German nuclear weapon is consequently more complex than the narrative of 11 men stopping Hitler's bomb suggests. Germany may not have been able to build the bomb regardless of what happened at Vemork, because the conceptual error in Heisenberg's critical mass calculation would have produced incorrect results from whatever material the heavy water program eventually enabled. The Allied planners who ordered the Vemork operation did not know this. They knew what Heisenberg's program required according to the intelligence available to them, and that intelligence was accurate in what it described, even if the program itself was proceeding on flawed assumptions. The decision to act against Vemork was rational given what was known, and the possibility that Germany's program would have failed on its own merits does not reduce the significance of the men who disrupted it. The German response to the Gunnerside sabotage extended beyond the immediate search for the perpetrators. Having understood that Vemork was a target that Allied Special Operations Forces would strike again if the opportunity presented itself, the German Occupation Administration made the decision in early 1943 to transfer the remaining heavy water stocks and the most critical production components from Vemork to Germany, where they would be beyond the reach of Norwegian resistance or British special operations. This decision, which was strategically sound given what had happened, required moving the heavy water by rail from the Rjukan Valley to the coast and then by ship to Germany. The route involved a section of the journey that crossed a body of water by ferry, Lake Tinn, which the railway line crossed at a point where no bridge existed and where the ferry SF Hydro was the only practical means of transit. Knut Haukelid, one of the 4 men who had spent 4 months on the Hardangervidda with the Grouse team and who had remained in Norway after the Gunnerside operation for subsequent resistance work, received the order from London to prevent the heavy water shipment from reaching Germany. The options were limited. Attacking the rail line would delay but not prevent transit. Attacking the train would destroy the cargo, but at a cost in German reprisals to the Norwegian civilian population that London judged unacceptably high. The ferry was the logical point of interdiction, but destroying a ferry on a lake required accepting that Norwegian civilians who used the same ferry would die. Haukelid understood this. The order was given and he accepted the mission. On the night of February 19th to 20th, 1944, Haukelid and 2 associates boarded the SF Hydro at the Mel ferry terminal while the vessel was docked for the night, reached the bilge compartment through a crawl space and placed a time bomb constructed from 19 pounds of plastic explosive, a clock mechanism and a detonation assembly that Haukelid had designed to trigger as the ferry crossed the deepest part of Lake Tinn. The charge was set and the 3 men departed before dawn. The SF Hydro sailed on schedule on the morning of February 20th. At 10:45 hours, while crossing the deep water section of the lake, the charge detonated. The ferry sank in 4 minutes. The heavy water barrels in the railway wagons aboard the ferry went to the bottom of Lake Tinn, which at that point reaches a depth of over 400 meters. Of the 53 people aboard the ferry, 14 Norwegian civilians and 4 German soldiers were killed. It was the price that London had accepted when giving the order and that Haukelid had accepted when he placed the bomb, a price that neither he nor the civilians who died could be said to have agreed to in any meaningful sense. The heavy water is still at the bottom of Lake Tinn. Dives conducted in recent decades have confirmed the barrel's presence on the lake floor. Germany's nuclear program never recovered the material or the momentum that the combination of Gunnerside and the hydro sinking had removed from it. Joachim Rønneberg lived until 2018. He died in Ålesund, the coastal city in western Norway where he had been born and to which he returned after the war at the age of 99. He worked for decades as a journalist and broadcaster for the Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation, a career whose principal professional demand was the precise use of language, which seemed appropriate for a man who had spent the most consequential months of his life communicating with London in encrypted radio messages of maximum brevity. When journalists and historians asked Rønneberg about the operation in the years after the war, he gave answers that were consistent in their refusal of the heroic framing that the questioners typically brought with them. He and his men had been well trained, he said. They had good information. The gorge was not as difficult as it looked. The German guard schedule had gaps in it that they were able to use. He was somewhat resistant to the characterization of the Vemork operation as the decisive blow against the German nuclear program, not because he thought the operation had been unimportant, but because he was a precise man who had read enough of the historical debate to know that the counterfactual was genuinely unclear. What he would say, without qualification, was that they had gone to Vemork because it needed to be done, and that they had done it as well as it could be done. Beyond that, he was generally content to let the record speak for itself. The record is, by any reasonable measure, sufficient. Knut Haukelid survived the war and wrote a memoir, Skis Against the Atom, published in 1954, which remains among the most direct accounts of Norwegian resistance operations during the occupation. Klaus Hellberg, who had been the Grouse team's primary scout and whose knowledge of the plateau terrain had been essential to the entire sequence of operations, was captured by German forces in March 1943 during a separate patrol, escaped from German custody by jumping from the window of a hospital where he was being treated for a leg broken in the initial capture, and crossed to Sweden on the broken leg through snow. This is recorded as fact, not as embellishment, in multiple independent sources. Fredrik Kaiser, Hans Storhaug, Kasper Idland and Halvard Hengja, the 4 members of the Gunnerside team whose names appear less frequently in accounts of the operation than Rønneberg and Haukelid, all survived the war. Jens Anton Paulsson, the leader of the Grouse team who had been on the plateau since October 1942, also survived, continued his military career and rose to the rank of colonel in the Norwegian army. Arne Kjelstrup and Knut Haugland, the other two members of the Grouse team, likewise survived. Of the 11 men who approached Vemork on the night of February 27, 1943, everyone came home. The Vemork plant still stands above the Vestfjord Valley. It was decommissioned as an industrial facility in 1971 and converted into the Norwegian Industrial Workers Museum, which opened in 1988 and houses a permanent exhibition on the heavy water sabotage, alongside displays on the history of the Norwegian industrial labor movement and the hydroelectric development that shaped the country's 20th century. Visitors to the museum can stand in the high concentration room where Rønneberg and Strømsheim placed their charges, a room that has been restored to something approximating its 1943 configuration, with the electrolytic cells reconstructed for display purposes. The window through which the demolition team made their final exit overlooks the gorge. From it, the valley floor where the river Mona runs 300 meters below is visible on clear days, and the cliff face on the approach side of the gorge, which Tronstad had assessed as climbable and which the team climbed in the dark in February, can be examined with the unhurried attention that visitors to museums are permitted, and that the men who descended it in darkness in winter were not. The broader Norwegian resistance, of which the Vemork operations were the most internationally recognized element, sustained itself through 5 years of occupation at a cost that was not distributed evenly across the population. The Norwegians who were killed during the occupation, in resistance activities, in reprisals, in deportations, represented a small percentage of a national population of approximately 3.5 million. But in a country of that size, each loss was felt differently than in larger nations, in communities where everyone knew the families involved, in valleys and coastal villages where the absence of the people who did not return was a permanent feature of the landscape. The Norwegian Jews who were deported in 1942, transported on Norwegian ships operated by Norwegian sailors under German order to the extermination camps in Poland, numbered approximately 770 people. Of this number, fewer than 40 survived. The Norwegian government's handling of this deportation and its relationship to Norwegian complicity in the occupation remain subjects of historical and moral examination in Norway, in ways that the heroic narratives of Gunnerside and the plateau resistance do not complicate but do not simplify either. A country's wartime record is not a single story. Norway's is not a single story. What Gunnerside established and what the broader sequence from the Grouse insertion in October 1942 through the hydro sinking in February 1944 demonstrated was something about the relationship between precise intelligence and effective action that the Allied Special Operations Program was still learning in early 1943 and would apply at progressively larger scale for the rest of the war. The freshman failure had been a failure of execution under conditions where the intelligence available was good, but the means employed were wrong. Gunnerside succeeded because the intelligence Tronstad provided was translated directly into operational specificity. Not just where the plant was and what it did, but which cells, which pipes, which connections, which drainage paths, which approach, which fuses, which charges, in what order, placed by whom, in how long. The precision was not incidental to the success. It was the success, the element that allowed 11 men with a limited explosive load and a 2-minute fuse to accomplish what a force of 41 trained engineers with a much larger explosive capacity had not been able to reach. The lesson was not that small teams were always superior to large ones, or that local knowledge always trumped conventional military strength, or any of the other generalizations that narratives of this kind tend to generate. The lesson was more specific, that the match between means and intelligence determines outcomes in ways that force alone does not, and that acting on imprecise intelligence with maximum force produces different results than acting on precise intelligence with minimum necessary force. Heisenberg was captured by the Alsos mission in May 1945, interned at Farm Hall in England with 9 other German nuclear scientists, and subjected to covert monitoring of his conversations with his colleagues in the months following Germany's surrender. The transcripts of those conversations, declassified decades later, reveal scientists struggling to understand why their program had failed, what the Americans had done differently, and what the fundamental physics of their own approach had actually implied. Heisenberg's discussion of the critical mass calculation, recorded in the farm hall transcripts, is a document that physicists have examined with considerable interest in the 80 years since, because it shows a man working through a calculation in real time whose result he had previously gotten wrong. The precise character of his pre-war error, and whether it was a genuine mathematical mistake or a deliberate fudging of numbers to present the Nazi state with a program that could not realistically be resourced by the German war economy, has been debated without resolution. Heisenberg himself in subsequent years suggested the latter interpretation, that he had intentionally produced estimates that would prevent the Nazi state from pursuing the bomb with the resources it would have required. Most physicists who have examined the evidence are skeptical of this account. The simpler explanation, that Heisenberg made a mistake that a more careful or differently situated physicist might not have made, fits the evidence at least as well. What is clear is that the German program, for whatever combination of reasons, was further from a functional weapon in 1943 than Allied intelligence estimated, and that the Vemork sabotage was directed against a threat that was real in its ambition and uncertain in its probability of success by the time the operation was executed. None of this changes what 11 Norwegians did on February 27, 1943. The intelligence available to the men who ordered the operation said that what they were destroying mattered. Tronstad, who had sat in British briefing rooms and told the SOE planners exactly where to put the charges, knew better than almost anyone alive what Vemork produced and what that production meant. He had dedicated the remaining years of his life, which ended in 1945 when he was killed in a separate operation in Norway, to denying Germany the resources his own scientific expertise had helped create. The men who went through the conduit acted on what was known, with the precision that Tronstad's knowledge made possible, at a risk that was total, in conditions that required a form of competence that years of training had built, but that no training could fully test in advance. They came back, the cells were destroyed, the heavy water drained away. Whatever Germany's nuclear program would or would not have accomplished with the material that Vemork produced, it did not have that material after the night of February 27, 1943. The accounting of what that absence cost Germany's physicists and what it may have cost the war's outcome is a calculation that history has not been able to close with the finality that clean narratives prefer. What history can close with finality is simpler. 11 men on skis, a gorge that the Germans left unguarded, a Norwegian chemist in London who knew every pipe in the building, and a 2-minute fuse. The lights in the high-concentration rooms stayed on throughout the operation. The cells were warm from the electrical current passing through them. Outside, the temperature was minus 27 degrees. The fuses were lit at approximately 23:30 hours. Runneberg and Stremsheim cleared the room. The explosion, when it came, was quiet enough that the guards on the bridge did not run immediately. By the time they understood what had happened, the cliff was already below the men who had climbed it, the river was behind them, and the plateau, white and featureless and theirs in a way that no occupation could reach, was ahead. Did you know the guards on the bridge heard the explosion and didn't know what it was? Write gorge in the comments. If this operation changed how you think about what precision actually means in war, and tell us, if you had been one of the 4 men waiting on that plateau for 4 months, at what point do you think you would have stopped believing the mission was still coming? Subscribe if stories this exact deserve a larger audience, and don't miss the next video.